Imagine a map of the world drawn in the year 1400. Europe sits in the center, a small cluster of kingdoms huddled around the Mediterranean. Africa's coastline fades into nothing below Morocco. The Atlantic Ocean is labeled with warnings: sea monsters, boiling waters, the edge of the earth. Now zoom out far enough, and you'll see the truth that nobody in 1400 could have known. An entire hemisphere sitting in the dark. Two massive continents, thousands of islands, civilizations with millions of people, rivers longer than any European had ever seen, mountain ranges that dwarfed the Alps. All of it invisible, all of it unknown. And then, in less than 100 years, the map exploded. Suddenly, the coastline of Africa stretched all the way down and around to India. Suddenly, there were islands in the Caribbean. Suddenly, there was Brazil, the Pacific Ocean, the Philippines, the entire shape of the planet rewritten in a single century. But here's what gets overlooked every single time this story is told. None of it happened because someone had a brilliant idea or a grand vision. It happened because of a boat, a specific boat, a small, fast, absurdly nimble little vessel that could do something no other ship on the planet could do at the time. It was called the Caravel. And it didn't just discover the New World, it accidentally created the most violent, chaotic, and legendary era of piracy the world has ever seen. To understand why the Caravel changed everything, you need to understand what sailing was like before it existed. In the early 1400s, European ships were designed for one thing: trade routes across the Mediterranean. That was the entire game. You loaded up wine, wool, spices, and silk in one port, sailed across relatively calm waters to another port, sold everything, and came back. The ships that dominated this trade were called cogs and carracks, big, heavy, round-hulled cargo haulers with square sails that caught the wind from behind and pushed the ship forward. And for the Mediterranean, they worked fine. The winds were predictable, the distances were short, the waters were sheltered. You didn't need anything fancy. You needed a floating warehouse, and that's exactly what a cog was. But the moment you left the Mediterranean and headed south along the African coast, everything fell apart. The winds along the West African shore don't blow in convenient straight lines. They shift, they swirl, they blow sideways, they blow against you. And if your ship can only sail with the wind pushing from behind, you're stuck. You can sail south just fine when the wind cooperates. But getting back north against the wind? Impossible. Your square-rigged cog would sit there like a bathtub, going absolutely nowhere. This is why European exploration stalled for centuries. It wasn't fear of sea monsters. It wasn't superstition about falling off the edge of the earth. It was physics. The ships couldn't get home, and nobody is going to fund an expedition if the crew can't come back to report what they found. Portuguese sailors had been poking at the African coastline since the early 1300s. They discovered the Canary Islands, they found Madeira, they reached the Azores. But every time they pushed further south along the African coast, the return trip became a nightmare. Some crews took months to fight their way back north. Others never made it at all. The Atlantic was swallowing ships whole, and the technology simply wasn't there to solve the problem. That's the world the Caravel was born into, a world where the ocean was a wall, not a highway. The man who changed everything wasn't a shipbuilder, he was a prince who never actually sailed anywhere significant himself. His name was Henry, and history remembers him as Prince Henry the Navigator, which is ironic because he navigated almost nothing personally. What he did was something arguably more important. He threw money at the problem. Henry was the third son of King John I of Portugal. Born in 1394, he grew up obsessed with two things: crusading against the Moors and finding a sea route around Africa to reach the gold and spice markets that Muslim traders controlled. In 1415, he helped capture the North African port city of Ceuta, and what he saw there changed his life. Ceuta was the endpoint of trans-Saharan gold caravans. The wealth flowing through that city was staggering, and all of it was controlled by overland routes that Portugal couldn't access. Henry's solution was simple in concept and monstrous in execution. If Portugal couldn't go through Africa, it would go around Africa by sea. He set up a base of operations at Sagres on the southwestern tip of Portugal and essentially created the world's first naval research and development program. He brought together shipbuilders, cartographers, astronomers, and experienced sailors. He funded expedition after expedition down the African coast, and when those expeditions kept failing because the ships couldn't handle the winds, he told his shipbuilders to fix it. What they came up with was the Caravel. The Caravel wasn't invented from scratch in some eureka moment. It evolved. Portuguese shipbuilders had been watching Arab dhows in the Mediterranean for decades. These Arab vessels used triangular sails, called lateen sails, that were rigged at an angle to the mast instead of hanging straight across like a square sail. The advantage of a lateen sail was something no European shipbuilder had ever achieved before. Instead of only catching wind from behind, a lateen sail could catch wind from the side. It could even angle into the wind, allowing the ship to sail in a zigzag pattern against the wind direction. Sailors call this tacking, and it was the single most important sailing technique in the history of exploration. The Portuguese took the lateen sail concept, combined it with a new hull design that was lighter, narrower, and shallower than a traditional cog, and created something entirely new. The resulting ship was small, usually between 50 and 80 feet long. It had 2 or 3 masts, all rigged with lateen sails. It sat shallow in the water, which meant it could navigate coastal waters, river mouths, and shallow harbors that bigger ships couldn't touch. And most critically, it could sail into the wind. For the first time in history, European sailors could go south along the African coast and actually come back. The technical specs of the Caravel sound modest by modern standards, but in the 1400s, this ship was a technological leap comparable to the jump from propeller planes to jet engines. A typical Caravel was around 60 to 70 feet long and about 20 feet wide. It displaced somewhere between 50 and 200 tons, depending on the specific build. Compare that to a carrack of the same era, which could displace 500 to 1,000 tons. The Caravel was tiny, but that was the point. The hull was Caravel built, meaning the planks were laid edge to edge instead of overlapping like on a clinker-built cog. This created a smoother hull surface, which reduced drag and made the ship faster through the water. Top speed for a well-built Caravel was around 8 knots, which doesn't sound impressive until you realize that most cargo ships of the era topped out at 3 or 4 knots. The Caravel was twice as fast as anything else on the ocean. The shallow draft, usually around 6 or 7 feet, was another game changer. Deep-hulled carracks needed harbors with significant depth. The Caravel could anchor in shallow bays, explore river estuaries, and pull up close to uncharted coastlines. This made it the perfect exploration vessel. You could literally sail it up to a beach, take a look around, and sail away. The crew was small, usually between 20 and 30 men. That meant less food, less water, less space needed for supplies. It also meant the ship could carry more cargo relative to its size or extend its range further before needing to resupply. But the real magic was always the sails. The lateen rig gave the Caravel an ability to point much closer to the wind than any square-rigged vessel. Where a cog might manage to sail at 90 degrees to the wind on a good day, a Caravel could manage 55 to 60 degrees. That extra 30 degrees of angle made the difference between getting home and dying at sea. As exploration demands grew, Portuguese shipbuilders created a hybrid version called the Caravela Redonda. This variant kept the lateen sails on the rear masts but added a square sail on the foremast. The square sail gave more speed when running with the wind on open ocean, while the lateen sails still allowed the ship to tack against the wind when needed. It was the best of both worlds, and it became the standard configuration for most long-distance voyages. Columbus's Niña, arguably the most famous caravel in history, started her voyage as a pure lateen-rigged caravel and was converted to a caravella redonda in the Canary Islands before crossing the Atlantic. Columbus made the change specifically because he knew the open Atlantic crossing would require more downwind speed than the lateen rig alone could provide. Once the caravel existed, the pace of Portuguese exploration went from a crawl to a sprint, and the map of the world started changing faster than anyone thought possible. In 1434, Gil Enes became the first European to sail past Cape Bojador on the West African coast. This might not sound like a big deal, but Cape Bojador had been the psychological end of the world for European sailors for over a decade. Henry the Navigator had sent 15 separate expeditions to get past that cape. 15. Every single one turned back. The currents were treacherous, the winds were hostile, and legend said the ocean beyond it boiled. Sailors swore that the sun would burn your skin black and the water turned to mud. None of it was true, but the fear was real enough to stop every crew that approached. Enes sailed past it in a caravel and came back alive. He brought back a plant from the shore beyond the cape, proof that land still existed, that life still grew, that the world didn't end at Cape Bojador. The psychological barrier that had held European exploration hostage for a generation shattered overnight. After Bojador, the dominoes fell fast. By the 1440s, Portuguese caravels had reached Senegal and the Gambia River. By the 1450s, they'd made it to Sierra Leone. By the 1460s, they were trading along the Gold Coast, which is modern-day Ghana. Gold, ivory, pepper, and enslaved people began flowing back to Lisbon in quantities that made Portugal one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Europe. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias did something that would have been literally impossible 30 years earlier. He sailed a caravel around the southern tip of Africa into the Indian Ocean, proving that there was a sea route from Europe to Asia. The cape he rounded was so brutal, so storm-battered, that he named it the Cape of Storms. King John II renamed it the Cape of Good Hope because the political implications were too valuable to let a scary name stick. 10 years later, in 1498, Vasco da Gama completed the circuit. He sailed from Lisbon around the Cape of Good Hope across the Indian Ocean and landed in Calicut, India. The sea route to the spice markets was open. The overland Silk Road monopoly held by Muslim and Italian traders was broken overnight. Portugal had just become the most strategically powerful maritime nation on earth, and every single mile of that journey was pioneered by caravels. While Portugal was methodically charting Africa's coastline, a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus had a different idea. Instead of going around Africa, what if you could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic? Columbus pitched this idea to the Portuguese first. They turned him down. Not because they thought the earth was flat, that's a myth. They turned him down because their mathematicians correctly calculated that the distance from Europe to Asia heading west was far too long for any ship to survive. Columbus had made a mathematical error in his calculations, underestimating the circumference of the earth by about 25%. The Portuguese knew the real numbers, and they knew any crew trying to sail that far would run out of food and water long before they reached Asia. So Columbus went to Spain instead. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were locked in a competition with Portugal for global dominance, and they were willing to take a gamble. On August 3, 1492, Columbus sailed from Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships. The Santa Maria was a carrack, the flagship and the largest vessel. The Pinta and the Nina were both caravels. And it's worth noting that Columbus preferred the caravels. He spent most of his time on the Nina, not the Santa Maria. The caravels were faster, more maneuverable, and handled better in unpredictable conditions. When the Santa Maria ran aground on a reef off the coast of Hispaniola on Christmas Day, 1492, Columbus wasn't particularly devastated. He used the timber from the wrecked carrack to build a fort and sailed home on the Nina. The Nina, by the way, survived the return voyage through some of the worst Atlantic storms anyone had ever recorded. Columbus himself later called her the best ship he'd ever sailed. That little Caravel, roughly 65 feet long and crewed by about 24 men, crossed the Atlantic Ocean and back. Twice. And it was just getting started. The Niña went on to complete at least 5 transatlantic crossings in its career. For a ship that was essentially built as a coastal explorer, that's an extraordinary testament to how well designed the Caravel really was. Columbus's 4 voyages between 1492 and 1504 opened up the Caribbean, Central America, and parts of South America to European contact. Other explorers followed immediately. Cabot reached Newfoundland in 1497. Cabral stumbled into Brazil in 1500. Magellan's fleet, which included caravels, left Spain in 1519 and completed the first circumnavigation of the globe in 1522. In 30 years, the map of the world went from a rough sketch to something recognizable, and every one of those voyages was either led by caravels or supported by them. Now here's where the story takes a turn that most documentaries about exploration skip over entirely. All of that discovery, all of those new trade routes, all of that gold and silver and sugar and spice flowing across the oceans, it created a problem. A massive, unavoidable, extremely profitable problem. Piracy. The connection between the Caravel and the golden age of piracy isn't just thematic. It's direct, mechanical, and undeniable. The Caravel created the conditions that made large-scale piracy not only possible, but inevitable. And here's how. First, the Caravel opened up trade routes that generated obscene wealth. Before the age of exploration, most European trade happened in the Mediterranean, where naval powers could patrol effectively and pirates had limited places to hide. The Mediterranean is essentially a big lake with well-mapped coastlines and established ports. Policing it wasn't easy, but it was manageable. The Atlantic was a different animal entirely. Once Portuguese and Spanish ships started hauling gold from West Africa, silver from the Americas, sugar from the Caribbean, and spices from Asia, the shipping lanes stretched across thousands of miles of open ocean. No navy on Earth could patrol all of it. The treasure was flowing, and nobody was guarding it. Second, the Caravel's own design made it the perfect pirate ship. Think about what a pirate needs. Speed, to catch merchant ships and outrun warships. Shallow draft, to hide in coastal inlets and river mouths where larger naval vessels can't follow. Maneuverability, to close in on a target from any angle, regardless of wind direction. Small crew requirements, because pirates don't have the luxury of recruiting from a pool of trained naval sailors. The Caravel checked every single box. It was fast, shallow, nimble, and required a skeleton crew. Pirates didn't have to invent a new kind of ship. The perfect pirate vessel already existed. They just had to steal one, and steal them they did. Throughout the late 1400s and into the 1500s, captured caravels became the backbone of pirate fleets operating off the African coast, in the Caribbean, and along the South American trade routes. French corsairs, English privateers, and North African Barbary pirates all operated caravels or caravel-derived vessels. The same technology that allowed Portugal to explore the world's coastlines allowed pirates to terrorize those same coastlines. Third, and this is the part that really connects the dots, the colonial empires that the Caravel built created the economic and political chaos that piracy thrives on. Spain and Portugal carved up the New World with the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, literally drawing a line on the map and saying everything on one side belongs to Spain and everything on the other belongs to Portugal. England, France, and the Netherlands were cut out entirely. These excluded nations didn't accept this arrangement quietly. They sponsored privateers, which were essentially government-sanctioned pirates, to raid Spanish and Portuguese shipping. Sir Francis Drake, the most famous English privateer, terrorized Spanish treasure fleets throughout the 1570s and 1580s. Queen Elizabeth gave him a license to plunder, and he did it with spectacular effectiveness. Drake's ships were small, fast, and maneuverable. Sound familiar? The design principles of the Caravel had spread throughout European shipbuilding by this point, and every nation was building fast, agile vessels inspired by the same concepts. When the wars of the 1600s ended and European governments stopped issuing privateer commissions, thousands of trained sailors suddenly found themselves unemployed. They had the skills, they had the ships, and they had the knowledge of trade routes and colonial ports that the Caravel had made accessible. Many of them had families to feed and no legitimate work available. The colonial powers had trained an entire generation of men to rob ships and then told them to stop. The transition from privateer to pirate was seamless. Why stop stealing when the only thing that changed was the paperwork? Port Royal, Jamaica, became the pirate capital of the Western Hemisphere precisely because of this dynamic. Privateers who'd been raiding Spanish shipping for the English crown suddenly found themselves without commissions. But the taverns were still there. The fences who bought stolen cargo were still there. And the Spanish treasure fleets were still sailing past every few months, loaded with silver from Potosi and gold from Mexico. The golden age of piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, was the direct consequence of a century of colonial expansion that the Caravel made possible. The pirates of the Golden Age didn't sail caravels exclusively. By the mid-1600s, ship design had evolved significantly. Brigantines, sloops, and eventually purpose-built frigates became the preferred vessels. But the DNA of the Caravel was in all of them. The sloop, which became the most popular pirate vessel of the Golden Age, was essentially the Caravel's philosophical descendant. Fast, shallow-drafted, maneuverable, and capable of being operated by a small crew. A sloop could carry maybe 75 men and a dozen cannons, but it could outrun anything the Royal Navy sent after it in shallow waters. Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge was a converted French frigate, but he also operated sloops for exactly the same reasons Portuguese explorers chose caravels over carracks. Speed and agility beat size and firepower when you're operating outside the law. Even the tactics were inherited. Portuguese caravel captains had perfected the art of using shallow waters as an escape route, ducking into river mouths and coastal shoals where heavier ships couldn't follow. Pirates used the exact same playbook 2 centuries later. Blackbeard haunted the shallow sounds of North Carolina specifically because the Royal Navy's deep-drafted warships couldn't pursue him there. It was the same advantage that caravel captains had exploited along the African coast, just repurposed for crime instead of exploration. The Caribbean itself, the epicenter of Golden Age piracy, only became a theater of operations because the Caravel brought Europeans there in the first place. Port Royal in Jamaica, Nassau in the Bahamas, Tortuga off the coast of Hispaniola. All of these infamous pirate havens existed because the Caravel had opened the door to Caribbean colonization a century earlier. The treasure that pirates chased was treasure that Caravel-era exploration had located. The shipping lanes they preyed upon were shipping lanes that caravels had charted. The colonial rivalries that fueled piracy were rivalries born from Caravel-era territorial claims. Remove the Caravel from history, and the entire chain of events unravels. Henry Morgan raiding Panama City in 1671, Bartholomew Roberts capturing 400 ships across the Atlantic, Anne Bonny and Mary Read fighting on Jack Rackham's sloop. Every one of these legendary stories traces back, ultimately, to a 60-foot Portuguese ship with triangular sails and a shallow hull. By the mid-1500s, the Caravel itself was already fading from the front lines of exploration. The voyages were getting longer, the cargoes were getting heavier, and the need for armed ships that could fight off pirates and rival navies made the small, lightly armed Caravel less practical. Carracks and eventually galleons replaced caravels as the primary ocean-going vessels. But the Caravel's influence didn't disappear. It evolved. The design principles, lateen rigging for windward performance, shallow drafts for coastal access, lightweight construction for speed found their way into virtually every class of sailing vessel that followed. The brigantine, the pinnace, the sloop, the schooner, all of them owe something to the innovations that Portuguese shipbuilders pioneered on the Caravel. The Caravel also changed the geopolitical map permanently. The Portuguese empire that Caravels built stretched from Brazil to Macau. The Spanish empire that Caravels helped launch became the largest in the world. The colonial age that followed reshaped every continent, displaced millions of people, and created the modern global economy. And yes, it created piracy, not as a side effect or an unintended consequence, but as an inevitable mathematical result. When you open up thousands of miles of unpatrolled ocean filled with treasure-laden ships sailing between poorly defended colonies, you get pirates. Every single time. It's not a bug in the colonial system. It's a feature that the colonizers never figured out how to fix. The Caravel was only about 60 feet of wood, canvas, and rope. It carried maybe 25 men and could barely hold enough supplies for a few weeks at sea. By every conventional measure of naval power, it was insignificant. It couldn't carry much cargo. It couldn't mount many cannons. In a straight fight against a fully armed carrack or galleon, it would be torn apart in minutes. But none of that mattered, because the Caravel could do the one thing that mattered more than size, firepower, or cargo capacity. It could go where no other ship could go, and it could get back. That's it. That's the whole secret. A boat that could sail into the wind, changed the shape of the world, built empires, destroyed civilizations, filled oceans with treasure, and turned thousands of desperate men into the most feared outlaws in history. Every pirate who ever flew a black flag in the Caribbean was, in a sense, a consequence of Portuguese shipbuilders in the 1430s solving a wind problem. Every treasure fleet that crossed the Atlantic was sailing a route that Caravels had charted. Every colonial port where pirates drank and spent their loot existed because a Caravel had landed there first. The next time you see a pirate flag on a t-shirt or a movie poster, remember that none of it would exist without a small Portuguese ship that barely makes it into the history books. The Caravel didn't just discover the new world, it built the world we live in, for better and for worse. If you want to see how one of those pirates, a man named Captain Kidd, went from respected privateer to the most wanted man on the ocean, that video is on screen now. Subscribe. I cover the real history behind the legends every week.